From the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored, this is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
I want to temper expectations that even if we do have a quiet revival, it probably is going to be a modest one compared to the first, second, and third, fourth Great Awakening.
This is your host, Scot Bertram. Welcome to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. That was Daniel Gullotta, assistant professor at The Ohio State University, also author of the recent essay, Faith Makes a Quiet Comeback. We'll go in depth with Daniel about that later on in today's program. First, we're joined by Dr. Charles Steele. He is director of the Center for Commerce and Freedom, associate professor of economics, and Herman A. and Suzanne S. Detweiler Chair in Economics at Hillsdale College. Dr. Steele, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here, Scott.
Talking today about the the concept of universal basic income, UBI, and there's a recent study on UBI, which we'll reference a little bit later on in our discussion. But to set the table, explain for us, what is universal basic income?
Universal basic income is the idea that the government would provide each person a certain amount of payment. Typically, you'd think a monthly payment, say $1,000 a month, but some sort of threshold that each person would receive, not means tested. That's UBI.
You've looked at it. You don't like it.
Not very much.
Understating a little bit. So let's walk through this a little bit. Does UBI, universal basic income, does it create a disincentive for work?
Yes. Stop and think for a minute. Why do we work? I really enjoy giving economics lectures, and I moved to Hillsdale in order to do it here. I would not have moved here if I weren't paid, even though I enjoy it. You work at the radio station. I think you're paid.
Yes, last time I checked.
Good. I always say that. I think you deserve it, but you earn it. But we work for pay. If you pay people to not work, you get less of it. And it's as simple as that. Many of the advocates of UBI will also be people who advocate increases in the minimum wage, and they claim to believe that if you raise the minimum wage and pay people more, they'll work more. Great. So if you're cutting the necessity to work and paying people to not work, you'll get less work. It seems quite obvious.
We saw during COVID, as the government handed out money to Americans, inflation surely followed. Under a universal basic income plan, could that also lead to increased demand without an increase in production, therefore an increase in inflation?
No, actually, I don't think that's the way to think about this. Inflation is really a monetary phenomenon. So unless you're increasing the money supply, it's not going to be inflationary. You would get maybe you could think of a one-time increase in prices as you probably get less work being done. The less work would probably be among the people who are not earning as much now. If I were given $1,000, it depends, of course, on the level of UBI. But if I were given $1,000, it doesn't mean that I would be working less. But for some people, it would. And so it might have an effect on output. And that would tend to raise prices, but it would be kind of a one-shot deal. It wouldn't be inflation.
There are some obvious consequences that we look at. Are there some unintended ones that we should consider if we are thinking about this sort of process? Yes.
And I'm hesitant to say unintended or not. I don't know the intent of people who are pushing UBI. Won't pretend to know. The one consequence, I think, of a UBI program would be that it would begin teaching people that it is a role of government to provide an income for people. And it's not a proper role of government to provide income. Government can only do that by taking from some others. A second thing that I think would happen is that even if if a universal basic income were set at a low level, the argument would be, well, that's not enough to live in a dignified fashion. Well, what is? And you'd have to end up raising income to the average. It's a redistributional system. I think that would be extremely harmful.
We'd roll back into similar arguments, I would imagine, that we hear about the minimum wage, which you mentioned earlier, which is, okay, set it here. Well, that's not enough. It needs to be a living wage. If we set a low UBI, well, that's not enough to live on. It's got to be a living UBI.
You'd very much have a ratchet effect. It would not go down. It would go up. And I think it would be... politicians would utilize this as a way to buy votes. Mm-hmm. That's why I say it may be intentional, not unintentional, but that's the effect that we would see.
Talking with Dr. Charles Steele about the idea of universal basic income. The great economist Milton Friedman had the concept of a negative income tax. How is universal basic income compare? How does it compare to the idea of this negative income tax?
Well, I don't like the Friedman idea of the negative income tax either, but they are different. They can have the same effect if they're if they're adjusted properly. But Friedman's idea was that one would have, for people below a certain income threshold, that they would get, instead of paying to the government, they get a payback from the government, depending upon what their income was. That's a little bit different. So it was the idea of means testing. If you were above this threshold, you would be paying income tax. If you're below it, you're receiving it. I think still it has those disincentive effects that are undesirable.
In the state of Alaska, there is something called the Alaska Permanent Fund Dividend. Payments go out to Alaska residents from oil revenues. Have you learned anything from that particular program that might be useful in this UBI debate?
My thinking is that that's quite a different kind of a program. That is akin to those are royalties that are paid on oil that is property of the state of Alaska. And so the residents of the state of Alaska are something along the lines of shareholders. They're just getting a share of royalties from sale of government property. So that's quite a different notion. It's also subject, of course, to the price of oil and how much oil is being pumped. So it's much closer to something like a stock dividend. And I think that's quite different from the UBI.
Dr. Charles Steele, as we talk about universal basic income, I mentioned at the top there is a recent real-world experiment study on UBI, and in the end it shows that it encouraged people to work less and earn less. Did we learn anything new from this paper, this experiment?
I don't think so. I think it was exactly what I would expect. That's the National Bureau of Economic Research study that was done. And they found that that the UBI had a disincentive effect that was larger for larger payments. And this was, of course, payment to people who were on the lower income level, people simply engaged in more leisure time. It's not surprising at all.
There are various cities that are attempting programs like this. Do you anticipate that's going to be the place where we see, if we see it, it would be in smaller municipalities rather than large state, or the country at least to start?
Of course, that depends upon who is in charge in Washington, D.C. And I don't think we're going to see UBI for the next 4 years, at least. I certainly hope we don't. Yes, I think you'll see it done at the local level, and particularly in blue cities.
Dr. Charles Steele, Director of the Center for Commerce and Freedom, Associate Professor of Economics, and Herman A. and Suzanne S. Detweiler Chair in Economics at Hillsdale College, as we talk a bit about universal basic income. Dr. Steele, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you, Scott.
Up next, Daniel Gullotta joins us. He's an assistant professor at The Ohio State University's Salmon P. Chase Center for Civics, Culture, and Society, also a transitional deacon in the Anglican Church in North America. We'll talk about faith making a quiet comeback. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Hey, it's Scot Bertram. and I've got a challenge for you today. Become a better educated American citizen. And to help you do just that, we at Hillsdale College have our free online courses available for all who wish to learn. Our challenge? Take just one of our courses. There are so many to choose from. You can discover the beauty of the Bible in the Genesis story, study the writings of C.S. Lewis, or explore the true meaning of America in Constitution 101. We have dozens more to choose from, and all these self-paced free courses feature Hillsdale faculty and scholars, many you've heard on this podcast. So visit hillsdale.edu/course, COURSE, and pick one of the more than 30 free Hillsdale courses. I hope you'll accept my challenge. Pick whichever course you like and become a more educated citizen today. Go to hillsdale.edu/course, COURSE. That's hillsdale.edu/course. Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to check out the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. You can find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio, including YouTube. All sorts of great Hillsdale College shows, including The Larry Arnn Show, Imprimis, and the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast. Check it all out at the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. We're joined by Daniel Gullotta. He is assistant professor at The Ohio State University's Salmon P. Chase Center for Civics, Culture, and Society. Also a transitional deacon in the Anglican Church in North America. You can find him on X at Daniel Gullotta. Daniel, thanks so much for joining us.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Also recently writing a piece at Compact Magazine, compactmag.com, Faith Makes a Quiet Comeback, a very interesting read. Why do you think we're seeing this quiet return to faith, especially among some young adults in places like both the UK and the US?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Obviously, there's not one-size-fits-all answer to why we're starting to see this quiet revival, as it's been dubbed. But some of the examples and citations that have been given is Gen Z sense of loneliness. Like, unlike other generations where they have grown up with strong family and community, sports, religion, school, Gen Z, partly because of declining birth rates, their parents being lonelier, less involved as well. There's a lot of detachment. And some of these Gen Zers are finding the community they've been looking for at church. Other people, it's meaning. The fact that Gen Z hasn't just been educated in a kind of postmodern relativism. They've actually been born into it, where everybody's truth is somewhat relative, especially growing up with the internet around them, where they're bombarded by different claims of virtue and vice and everything in between, that the fact that religions like Christianity, some forms of it anyway, make assertive truth claims is very, very powerful. And beyond that, probably the other thing is Christianity has always been on the cutting edge of technology, but I think for a while it was kind of left in the dust a little bit. The new atheists kind of had the edge when it came to the internet. Well, it seems that Christians have picked things up when it comes to social media. YouTube apologists, debates on TikTok, podcasting is huge. Mm-hmm. And then there's also media like The Chosen being like one of the highest grossing films. And it's a TV series about Jesus, where being interviewed by young people have said, I just kind of clicked onto it by accident and it's got me thinking things. So obviously there's not one size fits all, but there's all sorts of things we can point to.
Yeah, you write in this piece at Compact about young people using apps and praying through apps and listening to theology podcasts. And I think you even mentioned building churches in Minecraft. So is this is this what a new kind of spiritual life looks like? More digital, more personal, perhaps less connected or even disconnected from a sense of organized religion?
The one pushback I would give is that many of these apps and these digital faith communities have existed for a while. It's just they're experiencing an upgrade. Some of them are. That as the technology has gotten better, the apps have gotten more sophisticated. Beyond that, though, Christian Smith has done some research into this, and so has Ryan Brandt. One of the things that's particularly striking is the people who use these podcasts and use these apps are often already quite devout. So it's like an intensification.
Okay.
What's intriguing though is the young people who are using them are becoming quite devout. The people who are being initiated into these various faith traditions not being converted as lukewarm converts. There's often a joke about, the zeal of a convert. Well, that's kind of what we're seeing, where a lot of these converts just going to church on Sunday, they're downloading a Bible app. They're buying, an intense Bible study from their local Barnes and Noble. They are jumping onto Reddit to debate the hypostatic union of Christ.
Daniel Gullotta with us. You can read his piece, compactmag.com. Faith Makes a Quiet Comeback. One thing that stood out from the piece is this line about young churchgoers who are reporting less anxiety and reporting more hope. And that can be a pretty big deal in this age of rising mental health struggles, especially among our youth. What do you think that churches are offering that's helping from that perspective?
Yeah, studies for a long time have shown that religion, not just Christianity, but any kind of traditional religion, actually has huge mental health benefits. One of the things that a lot of the new atheists opine, or even not the new atheists, like some psychologists like Jonathan Haidt, they talk about if we could only just hack religion, get rid of the supernatural stuff, because there's so much good stuff in there. In terms of like what they're offering, again, I think there's a whole sushi train of things that are offered. For some people, it's, they're very lonely, and this offers a baked-in community. But beyond the baked-in community, one of the things that's really interesting, speaking of Jonathan Haidt, is that young people psychologically benefit from interacting with people across different ages and work-life backgrounds, races and ethnicities. And many churches, especially the ones in the UK, that have people who are in their 50s, their 60s, as well as their teenagers and 20s. And from, you could have migrants from Africa. You could have people who have lived in London their whole life. You could have international students who are just at Cambridge or Oxford visiting. And like being surrounded by that in Sunday out has huge benefits about understanding the world around you. But beyond that, just even something really mundane is offering counsel. Just like, I know Bob, Bob, who's a mechanic, can help me with my car, or we go to church on Sunday. So just like having those networks that young people don't have growing up because of the diminishing sense of neighborhoods and communities. Beyond that as well, there's often, anxiety can be relieved about eschatology, which is one of those fancy words about, what comes next, the end of the world. If you believe, Gen Z has been raised with a sense of justice, very strong justice about no, wrongdoers must be punished by the law. And obviously we want that. But, once you grow up, you do learn the dark truth, especially as we've seen in the media, things like the Me Too movement, for example, where men in power were able to get away abusing women for decades on end. And some people obviously have gone to their graves getting away with this. But when you have a God that says judgment is mine and that those people will pay the price in the end for their misdeeds and their sins, I think that can also speak to what Gen Z is craving with a sense of justice.
Yeah.
And that's just one example, but there's often, you could talk about environmental work as well, that, the new heaven and the new earth, so fears of the environment. But that doesn't mean we can just like forget about it. It often couples with like the sense of, Christian ecology, where, the first human beings were gardeners. So we have to take care of God's creation, and God will renew creation. So it kind of works in tandem. So again, there's not a one-size-fits-all answer, but there's so many benefits.
This is along those points you were making. We have heard for some years now about young Americans looking for the same benefits they might get from faith elsewhere, meaning friends and community and something to put their hopes and dreams in, and looking at climate change or social activism or things like that. Is there anything in particular or a reason they're not finding fulfillment in those particular areas and now perhaps returning to faith and the church?
A lot of millennials and Gen Z try to replace religion with Harry Potter or wokeness, politics, environmentalism. It's a good question. Why does it not offer the same thing? I think one answer that could be given is many of these alternatives are hyper-individualistic. Whether it's something that looks quasi-religious, like astrology, it's still very much on the individual. There is no pope of astrology. There is no pastors in astrology or rabbis or imams. You're pretty much still on your own. And even like some of the political activism stuff, even though there is a group mentality, for a long time, there's been this emphasis on leaderless activism where we don't want leaders. It has to be far more spontaneous and grassroots. But it turns out people actually like leaders. People actually need people to help them dictate morality and things like that. So I think the individualistic elements. Beyond that as well, I also think that there is a corporatism that young people are waking up to a lot more. So the fact that there is I use the example of astrology where, the fact that there are so many companies out there willing to cash in on the vibes, as the kids say, or even, issues with like environmentalism or LGBTQ issues, that there's Pride Month and things like that. And then brands change their logos to, hype up sales. And I think young people look at that and they're just like, oh, this is just really hollow, and they're pandering to me. But then when you have a church, whether it's the Catholic Church, the Presbyterian Church, Anglican Church, or various synagogues that don't change, they don't bend to society's whims, I think there's something like, whoa, that's interesting. Like, that's like, you're telling me that you don't participate in XYZ? I think that really also appeals to them as well.
Daniel, you mentioned new atheism a while ago. I want to talk about that a bit because for a while it seemed it was everywhere, but it seems as though it's lost steam. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I mean, I talk about this in my article. There's a lot of reasons why it lost steam, but I think the most powerful reason why it lost steam on a cultural, societal level is people kind of just got sick of the antics. That while it was fun for a little bit to mock Christians and do memes of Kirk Cameron and bananas and things like that, eventually it turned out that the internet is a really cruel place already. Do I really want to add into that? Do I really want to imbibe some of that? And sort of like the worst stereotypes about, the old joke, how do you know someone's an atheist? Don't worry, they'll tell you. People started to incarnate that at a very real and mocking level. So I think on a societal level, people just got sick of the jerkiness of it. But beyond that as well, there were more other institutional things that, they didn't really build clubs or schools or organizations. They too were rocked by various different scandals, similar to church scandals. So again, the cart didn't fall too much from what they were critiquing in many people's eyes. And then, of course, because so much of new atheism was of a liberal progressive politics, much like we've seen the Civil War on the left in other spaces, whether it's universities or activism groups, new atheism has not been spared. They too have gone through their own left-on-left disputes that have left the movement fractured and divided.
That tone you mentioned, there are still religious nuns today, people who check that nun box. they don't necessarily have that same tone that the new atheist might have. They're not angry about things. They might just be indifferent to religion. Is that shift something else we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, this group of people is one of the hardest groups to pin down because they're so diverse in what they believe or don't believe. For listeners who don't know what we're talking about NONEs. When you're given a list by Gallup or Pew, you can give, when you're asked about your religion, you're allowed to say none. Now, some of the nuns are atheists. They do not believe in gods, but they don't like the label atheist. Some people are harder to pin down. So some people, for example, they don't believe in the Christian God, but they believe in reincarnation and karma, but they wouldn't call themselves a Hindu. Mm-hmm. So how on earth would you categorize someone like that? Or even more vague, with the vibes, how do you describe somebody who doesn't go to church all that often, but believes that all paths lead to some sort of divine inclination? And they don't believe truth can be held in any one religion, but they do believe in some sort of God that transcends reality. What box do they tick? They often tick none. What do you call somebody who believes in ghosts and demons, but isn't really a Jesus follower? All of this is to say is that they're a very, very hard group to define, very difficult. One of the phrases that has been developed that spiritual but not religious is another descriptor for many of the people who fall in the none category.
Mm-hmm. You also wrote a follow-up piece of sorts over at World at WNG.org. A quiet revival may be a small one. How can we tell the difference between what might be some genuine trends emerging and perhaps a little too much optimism about what we're seeing?
A lot of people were emailing me about my piece at Compact, and I was very flattered about all the attention it got. And people on Twitter, because this is what we do, we are so back, or we're baby, as the kids like to say. But because people, I think they overread what I was writing in Compact. People were focusing on the revival part, but not the quiet part. So to give an example, many people are talking about the revival or the booming numbers we're seeing in Roman Catholic churches, especially Latin Mass Roman Catholic churches or Greek Orthodox churches. They're like, wow, they're growing by 10% or numbers like that. But what people are not paying attention to is some of these churches had 30 people in it. So if 3 extra people go, that's a growth of 10%. So it's not like these churches are, full per se. So that was like one of the things I really wanted to push back on, that we have to be very careful. We have to pay attention to the quiet part and the revival part. Because as other sociologists have pointed out, Gen Z is still incredibly secular, incredibly indifferent to religion. So even if we are seeing this slight uptick, it is slight. And then the $1 million question, how long does it last? Mm-hmm. Because as I wrote in World, many of these people, once they left college, for example, they dropped Christianity, or when they got to college, they never came back, despite how zealous they were in high school. So yeah, I want to temper expectations that even if we do have a quiet revival, it probably is going to be a modest one compared to the first, second, and third, fourth Great Awakening.
Yeah, and we've been in similar situations before. I recall some stories about millennials who might lead a return to faith, and that didn't really stick. Is there something different happening this time, or can we approach this in a different way this time?
So many of the things that were written about millennials seem, speaking as a millennial, are eerily similar. I do think there are differences. Millennials and Gen Zs are different. Many millennials remember a time without the internet. Gen Z does not. Gen Z has grown up, not just high-speed, hyper-connected internet as well. So very different there. millennials still grew up with a kind of Christian normativity in many ways. Gen Z pretty much has not, where to go to church is something special for a lot of Gen Zers. It'd be a bit of an oddity. You might have a friend who does it, but the vast majority of people do not around you. So I think that like little things like that does make it different. In terms of like what could make it stay, for example, the thing that gives me hope is that many of the traditions people are being attracted to, the traditions that I think do have longer staying power, that they are, the Catholic Church, the Lutheran churches, the Presbyterian churches, the Anglicans and Orthodox, that many of these churches are very well situated with different sacraments for different periods of life, different initiations, different goals. They're very holistic when it comes to young people, families, and the elderly, which I think is good. Mm-hmm. So I do think there could be opportunity, but then again, there are also perils as well that we need to be mindful of.
What kind of signs might we want to watch for over the next 5 years, 10 years to track and see if this is really a revival that has some stickiness to it and not just a trend or a moment that we might be talking about coming around again 15 years from now?
Yeah, good question. So here are the things I'm looking out for. First of all, just raw data. I just want to I'm following, if you're interested in this, Gallup and Pew, Barna Group, these groups are publishing data every once in a while. So we just have to follow the data and see what happens there. At a more obvious level, I'm really intrigued by some of the elites. Are elites still talking about this? And we can even talk about religious elites. Some of the people who have become Christian publicly as celebrities, are they still celebrities quite publicly? Is it still important to their digital public forward-facing identity? So one example I would give is a woman by the name of Nala. She was a top-earning OnlyFans model who eventually repented, got baptized, completely rejected pornography, and is now kind of rebranded herself as a Christian influencer. And she's making the podcast circuits, talking about the dangers of pornography and the perils of OnlyFans, and very much with Jesus at the forefront. Is she still doing this after 5 years? People like her, that would be like an interesting indicator to me. She still might be Christian after 5 years, but is it really integral to her identity? The things like that, publishing trends, things like that. And then, of course, what happens after the next presidential election? That would be the other big thing. This is one of my colleagues is working on, marriages. One of the big things that people are concerned about is the Christian revival that we are seeing, modest though it is driven by men, which is very, very interesting because most revivals have been driven by women. So the question will be are the dudes sticking around? And the big question, what happens when these guys try to get married? Can they get married? What does that look like? Do they stick with church after marriage? Or, because, more and more women are leaving Christianity, do the women come back to church thanks to their husbands? Mm-hmm. Or do they leave church thanks to their wives? Or does something else happen? That's a big question for me.
Daniel Gullotta, you can read his piece at compactmag.com, Faith Makes a Quiet Comeback, and a follow-up at worldwng.org, A Quiet Revival May Be a Small One. Daniel Gullotta is assistant professor at The Ohio State University's Salmon P. Chase Center for Civics, Culture, and Society. You can find him also on X at Daniel Gullotta. Daniel, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Up next, Ben Whalen from Hillsdale's English Department returns as we conclude his series about the writings of Mark Twain. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Hi, I'm Benjamin Payne. At the K-12 Education Office at Hillsdale College, we support school founding groups and their efforts to start classical schools across the country. Finding the right leader is one of the first and most important steps to building a successful school. While we do consider experience and education, we seek candidates who exhibit unwavering personal integrity, honesty, courage, and servant-hearted leadership. Perhaps that's you. If you're looking to engage in fulfilling, impactful, and challenging work protecting our nation's future and building up the next generation of virtuous citizens, we'd love to hear from you. I'm looking for strong school leaders right now. Learn more about how you can make a difference at hillsdale.edu/leader. hillsdale.edu/LEADER. That's hillsdale.edu/leader.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Follow us on X. We're at Hillsdale Radio. You'll get updated show and guest information. And follow the Hillsdale College Podcast Network at HC Podcasts. We're joined by Dr. Ben Whalen, Associate Professor of English here at Hillsdale College. Dr. Whalen, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
Continuing our conversation about Mark Twain. Last time we talked about the Adventures of Tom Sawyer. This time we talk about the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. As we do, I'm reminded of a conversation I had with Dr. Todd Back from our Spanish department here. We were talking about Don Quixote, and there's two parts of Don Quixote. There's a part one, and then a few years later, there's a part so commercially successful of part two, a sequel. And here we have a spin-off. Is this like an early spin-off? Is this one of the early examples of that?
Absolutely. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn owes a huge debt to Cervantes, to Don Quixote. This Don Quixote goes and has all of these different adventures, and Huckleberry Finn does similarly. So we can call it a picaresque novel because it takes this character and we see him go through these different iterations and series of adventures. And so, yes, Huckleberry Finn is a little Don Quixote in a way.
What makes Huck Finn such a relatable and enduring character in American literature?
So one of the interesting things is that Huckleberry Finn is definitely written as a sequel to The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. In The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, the narrator is third person. But in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, it's a first person narrator from Huckleberry Finn. So the entire time we're reading the novel, we're hearing Huck's voice. And we see him as he goes through different adventures and different moral questions. We hear his really charming, innocent, boyish voice wrestling with the adventures and wrestling with the moral questions that come up. And it's utterly charming. So just the narrative voice, Twain's conception of the character, the fact that we receive reality filtered through the eyes of this little 11-year-old, it's really lovely and charming.
I guess I want to start here because we spent our last conversation on Tom Sawyer and talked a lot about the characterization. He's a scamp, right? How would you contrast these two characters, Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn?
Yeah. So Tom Sawyer is definitely the more civilized, if I can call it that. He's been adopted by his aunt and he lives with her. And though he gets in all sorts of adventures, Huck Finn is the wilder boy. Huck is not actually quite an orphan at the opening of the novel. His father is the town drunk, and he wanders through from time to time. But so Huck actually spends his childhood living in a hogshead barrel by the edge of the Mississippi. And so because he doesn't have a family in any real sense, he doesn't have to go to church and he doesn't have to go to school. And so he's the envy of all the other little boys in the town, including Tom. And so he's the less civilized, the more wild in that way figure.
What are some of the main themes that we get to explore in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn?
Well, overall, what happens in the novel is that Huck, trying to get away from his drunken, abusive father, and this slave, Jim, trying to escape from being sold down the river, they get on a raft and they have this grand journey down the Mississippi River in an aim finally for Jim to find freedom. And by the end of the novel, he is freed. So overall, the novel is about a grand journey from slavery to freedom. And that's the sort of the general structure. So one of the main themes then we would think is Twain looking at slavery. And the novel is published in the 1880s, but it's set in the 1830s or 40s. So it's very interesting that the novel that is really thinking about slavery is written after the Emancipation Proclamation. There are not actual slaves in America in the 80s. And yet, of course, the problems that slavery gave rise to, problems of racism, of culture, of the problems of Reconstruction and of segregation, those are still problems for America and the time Twain is writing. And so the novel is still thinking about race, about language, and about slavery in important ways.
Huck Finn is set on the Mississippi River. It influences the narrative greatly. Can we even consider the river itself as a character in Huck Finn?
Yeah. It's been said that the main character of Huckleberry Finn is actually the Mississippi River, and the river is terribly important. It's, for instance, when Jim and Huck are on their raft floating down the river, they have all these lovely, sort of charming philosophical conversations, and they'll often lie on the raft completely naked, Huck will tell us. And so we see that actually the river allows them this little island of innocence, untainted by the world. And then as they land at different places, as they go down the river, we see that innocence of the world that the river creates contrasted with the messiness and the ugliness of different real parts of civilization. And so the river is this central pulsing force in the novel. It also allows for the establishment of certain relationships and sort of resetting things such that Huck will finally come to look at Jim as a full human man rather than as chattel.
Talking with Dr. Ben Whalen about the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. How does Mark Twain use the various moral dilemmas that Huck finds himself in to sort of address the conflict between what is expected and what you think is right, the personal conscience?
Yeah. We could say in another way that this novel is really about the cultivation of a moral conscience. Mm-hmm. And it's Huck's conscience, because Huck starts off the novel, he enjoys Jim's company, but he does regard Jim as a slave and hence as property, and so should be returned to his owner. And over the course of the novel, Huck has enough experiences that his entire conception of Jim changes. And so he goes through this work to free Jim from captivity at the end of the novel. It's a triumph for Huck. But the question is, how can Huck reorient the way he looks at these slaves and see them as human beings with inherent dignity that means that they should have freedom? So that's what's going on. The cultivation of the moral conscience and of the moral imagination for Twain in this novel has to do with coming through adventure after adventure to know this other man better and better until you understand that he deserves freedom because you love him so much. So I think it's a very interesting message for Twain, in part, is that the Emancipation may have set the slaves free. The Emancipation Proclamation may have set the slaves free, but it didn't set everyone in harmony together. For harmony in society, we have to love our neighbor. And that's really what we see going on, is that Huck comes to love Jim, and through that love, treat him properly and with the dignity that he deserves.
We get to know Jim better through the course of Huck Finn, as well as he sort of challenges the stereotypes of the time. How does Twain deal with this? Because we have a novel that's set in the 1830s.
That's right.
And released in the 1880s.
That's right.
And in between, we have this Civil War,
right,
about this question of slavery. And so there's a lot of different angles and approaches that can be taken. How does Twain's care with the character of Jim sort of address that conflict?
Yeah, it's really brilliant on Twain's part, because what you get over the course of the story is the reader also comes to see how good a man Jim is, and that he's really admirable. You have respect for him. He sacrifices his own freedom to help Tom Sawyer when he gets shot at one point. And so you see this nobility and goodness in Jim that's undeniable. But what I think is really excellent too is that Twain doesn't romanticize and idealize Jim either. Mm-hmm. So he doesn't make Jim, who is a slave and barely literate, he doesn't make Jim somehow magically a genius. or he's a silly man in certain ways, and foolish and ignorant, and yet good and lovable and dignified. And so Twain's characterization, it doesn't idealize, and yet it leads the reader to admire this man.
What kind of insight do we get from Huck Finn about the lives of the people during this time?
It's a great question. I think you see certainly some of the ugliness of racism. I think certainly you see some of the great charity that people can have towards others. You see the difficulty for the country in overcoming the racial problems even after the Civil War. But I actually brought a quote from T.S. Eliot about Huckleberry Finn that I think is worth sharing as well, because he talks, the novel is not just about slavery. That's certainly a part of it, but Eliot captures something here that if you don't mind, I'll read it. This is T.S. Eliot. In Huckleberry Finn, Mark Twain wrote a much greater book than he could have known he was writing. Perhaps all great works of art mean much more than the author could have been aware of meaning. Certainly, Huckleberry Finn is the one book of Mark Twain's which, as a whole, has this unconsciousness. So what seems to be the rightness of reverting at the end of the book to the mood of Tom Sawyer was perhaps unconscious art. And here's the point. For Huckleberry Finn, neither a tragic nor a happy ending would be suitable. No worldly success or social satisfaction, no domestic consummation would be worthy of him. A tragic end also would reduce him to the level of those whom we pity. Huck Finn must come from nowhere and be bound for nowhere. His is not the independence of the typical or symbolic American pioneer, but the independence of the vagabond. His existence questions the values of America as much as the values of Europe. He is as much an affront to the pioneer spirit as he is to business enterprise. He is in a state of nature as detached as the state of the saint. In a busy world, he represents the loafer. In an acquisitive and competitive world, he insists on living hand to mouth. And the quote goes on, but I think Twain captures something there, T.S. Eliot captures something there about Twain's work, which is that we get this really interesting character who questions really what lies at the heart of American culture and the American imagination. And it is related to race, but there's more to it than that. You also question being acquisitive, and you question the frontier, and you look at these different virtues and these different intense situations and see how this little innocent boy does navigate them and exhibit virtue and greatness despite his being not quite civilized.
Also, is there discussion or allusions to not just race, of course, but class, social hierarchy around these times?
Absolutely. And in fact, the novel famously ends with Huck deciding that he can't stand to go back and be civilized and taught, so he's going to light out for the territory at the end. And so you have the sense of a criticism, not just of slavery, because by that point, Jim is freed, but really, or maybe criticism is putting it too strongly, but a questioning, an exploration, a wrestling with issues of civilization versus nature, and of art versus nature, and then of different classes and of the point of education. There's a sense in the novel, in fact, that Tom Sawyer, when he re-enters, he's the much more well-read and much more educated person. And yet he is also the one much more likely to treat Jim like property, to view Jim simply as chattel. And so you get the implication that civilization and education can corrupt rather than free. And so the novel really wrestles with those sorts of themes and questions.
Talking with Dr. Ben Whalen, Associate Professor of English here at Hillsdale College, about the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. As beloved and well-read as this novel is, there are criticisms and critiques. It is not taught in some schools. What are those critiques, and how have they been addressed by say, critics and others? Yeah,
so one of them, it's very interesting actually to me with this novel, because even when it was first published, it provoked a lot of controversy and was banned by the Concord Public Library because it was deemed as having of teaching boys how to misbehave, of corrupting the youth, and that it wasn't good for civilized boys. Louisa May Alcott, for instance, famously did not think it was suitable reading for children. And Twain loved that, by the way. He knew that any publicity is good publicity and that this is just going to sell more copies. But over the course of the 20th century, of course, the debate shifted. And rather than thinking the novel was inappropriate because it was corrupting boys, the prevalent use of the N-word throughout the novel has become a flashpoint of controversy, and it's one of the primary reasons why the book won't be taught anymore. Or there are also editions of the book now that replace each instance of the N-word with the word slave, and that works fairly well without doing damage to the narrative as a whole. I will say that the conversation still goes on today about how the use of the N-word in the novel, how hurtful that might be to students in our classroom. It's a delicate issue, certainly. My own view on the issue is that just as Twain is very careful and thoughtful about dialect, so he is with that word, and that Twain deploys it intentionally to show how it corrupts the way people look at things. That is, the words we use matter for Twain. And so that word is a way of dodging the humanity. So it is ugly when it appears in the novel, but Twain means for it to be ugly because he wants to show how if you call somebody a slur repeatedly, you will look at them as less than human. And so I'll emphasize this to my students at Hillsdale. We read an unexpurgated version with the N-word where it appears because Twain is intentional. He wants us to think about how the words we use shape the way we see the world. And that's a really important lesson for us today.
The other conversation in which the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn often appears is in the conversation about the great American novel. I've overheard these discussions among members of the English department here at Hillsdale College, and everyone has his or her own choice. So is The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn the great American novel?
It's a great question. It's actually really funny, Scott, because the concept of the great American novel originated in 1868. A scholar referred to the great American novel, and he thought that, in fact, the great American novel hadn't yet been written, but that Uncle Tom's Cabin was probably the best we have. And so Huckleberry Finn is actually written after the conversation of the great American novel has already started. And this is a curious conversation because, after all, we don't tend to talk about other nations' literatures in the same way. So there isn't like the great British novel. There are too many great ones. Who would you pick? And similarly, or the German or the Russian. But I do like the idea of the great American novel as this concept. Is there a novel that captures sort of America in all of her manifold different ways of being? And if that's what we're looking for, Huckleberry Finn, in the way that it's a picaresque novel, in the way that you see all different strata of society, all these different places, you see America from Missouri all the way down the river. You do get something representatively American here. So I love this novel. For my money, it's right in there among the great American novels. Certainly you would think in the 19th century, you also think of Melville's Moby Dick, and that's right there as well. But these two great novels really do give us 19th century American culture in its vagaries, in its strengths and weaknesses, in its virtues and vices.
Dr. Ben Whalen is Associate Professor of English here at Hillsdale College as we talk about Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. We previously talked about Tom Sawyer, previously about Twain, his life, his background, and, well, we'll likely revisit sometime in the future as well. Dr. Ben Whalen, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thanks so much for having me.
That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Dr. Charles Steele from Hillsdale College, Daniel Gullotta, writing in CompactMag.com about faith making a quiet comeback, and Ben Whalen from Hillsdale's English department. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.